But before I introduce the first session, I want to introduce you to President Roelofs, president of Berea College, who has come to share a few words with us.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great honor to welcome all of you to Berea College and the Appalachian Symposium. My name is Lyle Roelofs, and I'm the 9th president of this amazing college, and we couldn't be happier than being able to host this amazing gathering. The connection between Berea College and Appalachia goes back more than 100 years, really even back to our very founding in the 1850s. Although I have to admit that in the 1850s, the concept of Appalachia had not yet been invented as a region of the country. And the fact that we were serving mostly students from this region was not because we were choosing to, but because it was difficult for those students to travel any distance to a different college, being mostly impoverished. Today, that situation is different in that we do intentionally serve the youth of Appalachia. By mandate of our Board of Trustees, and in light of our great commitments, we draw 70 to 80% of our students from the region of Southern Appalachia and the whole Commonwealth of Kentucky. We've become a very selective institution. In fact, we're the most selective institution in our state, and therefore we get applications from all over the country and indeed all over the world, but our focus remains on providing educational opportunities in Appalachia. Being dedicated to serving a population of mostly low-income families required us long ago, in the 1890s in fact, to stop charging tuition. We were finding that the students were not able to pay it anyway, and they were having to interrupt their college studies in order to gain the 50 cents they needed for the next semester. So we eliminated tuition entirely, and our business model now works with two main sources of revenue. One is that we depend on the generosity of our alums and many other friends of the college to carry the bulk of the weight of providing funding. And then in addition, as you probably know, every student at Berea College works for the college, which enables us to operate more efficiently, and some of those students work in revenue-producing areas as well. So that basic model has worked, and today we're a financially strong institution with excellent facilities like the one you're enjoying here, serving more than 1,600 students from whom we're collecting a grand total of $0 in tuition. Dean Chad Berry, a scholar of Appalachia himself, and he is here. Dean Berry, together with the faculty of Berea, are proud to offer a high-quality, demanding liberal arts education to these students. With a 10-to-1 student-faculty ratio, our classes are small, and students have close relationships with their faculty members and with their labor supervisors. As a result, our graduation rate is impressive, and many, many lives have been transformed. You are here because of your love of literature and your attachment to Appalachia as well. As an institution, we share those values and are tremendously enriched by the great writers who have chosen to make this their home. Writers like Crystal Wilkinson, the internationally known Bell Hooks, who delivered the keynote address yesterday, Jason Howard, editor of the Appalachian Heritage, Loyal Jones, founding director of the Appalachian Center, and especially Silas House, who has arranged this wonderful gathering while all the time maintaining a very intense schedule of a significant public intellectual. So we are greatly enriched by them, but we're also greatly enriched by all of you that you've chosen to join us for this gathering. So again, welcome. And I know that today's discussions and activities will be just as enjoyable and enriching as yesterday's were. Thanks very much.
That's a hard one to follow up. Berea is really a wonderful place is what it comes down to, believe me. So our first session this morning is The Nature of Loss, Displacement in Appalachian Literature. And we're going to be hearing from Lisa Parker, Jane Hicks, Denise Giardina, and Maurice Manning. George L. Lyon wasn't able to come as a back injury. Then our second session after that is going to be Writing for the New Millennium with Amy Green, Charles Dodd White, Glenn Taylor, and Robert Gipe. I give you our speakers.
It's been given to me to moderate this group. And as I said, our topic is loss and displacement. So when you have a panel of people who write about strip mining, some of your early books, a book title like This Gone Place, a book title like The Gone and the Going Away, you know you have the right people on your panel. My last book was named Driving with the Dead, which implies loss. So if you get the promotional material for it, it says this is a book about loss. So I thought that we would start this morning by asking Maurice to read, and then we will take some discussion from there. Maurice?
Is this working? I was especially glad to be part of this discussion because it's real easy to look around and see small communities disappearing, or see widespread environmental degradation and just be utterly depressed. And to grieve it and just be completely consumed by the grief. And the more you think about it, the bigger it becomes in some ways. And that was my experience when I was finishing my fourth book, which is called The Common Man. And about the time I was wrapping up the book, I realized, good Lord, everybody that I'm writing about in my mind is dead. Or the character of the small communities that I'm thinking of has changed utterly and has just become washed over with general mass American culture that we get from TV and advertising and just the one-size-fits-all idea, and that gave me a lot of grief for a while. But I've realized if I want to keep writing poetry, I've got to play another tune than just elegy after elegy after elegy. So I thought what I would do is I'll read a poem from The Common Man where I was consciously recalling my first-hand kind of immersion in Appalachian stuff. And then I'll read another poem from my most recent book where I had realized I had to make some transition from elegy to something hopefully better. So this first poem is called The Pupil. Time was, I was there, halted beside the drum stove. It glowed. There was a skillet set on its head. Biscuits were rising on the coal-black brim. I had a book and a full-grown woman beside me. You might not believe it, but I was teaching her to read. Her father was in the other room. He lay beneath a quilt to make us think he was asleep. I could see his boots still on his feet, pointing at the sooty ceiling. He didn't want his daughter to learn to read. There was a hole in the roof, and a cat climbed through it into the stiff heat. An ancient woman who never spoke and never noticed the cat was strapped to a chair with a belt. I had forgotten the part about the cat and the belt and the painted eyes of the woman. Why was I until this moment afraid to remember her? What kept her out? Now the daughter didn't call her father Daddy. "Diddy," she said, "Diddy, get up, we got company. There's biscuits coming, and besides, I'm a-fixin' to read." "Why, even Granny wants to see, don't you, Granny?" She tapped her fingers on the old woman's leather hand, then shook her head and turned to me. "Dat Diddy's awful moody," she said, and laughed. I peeked into the shadow of his room. Her Diddy didn't flinch. He didn't draw a breath. His boots crowed like parentheses around a word that had no letters, a space where nothing held its place, a blank, for instance, a mute as in. What else was there to do? That Diddy wasn't any smarter than the handle of a broom, yet still he knew. He knew no book would help, no word would hold him back from sleeping off the life God gave him. Biscuits, a hole in the roof, a quilt to cover up his eyes, a daughter who couldn't read her name. I'll just read a very short poem from The Gone and the Going Away. And by the way, nobody can really see this, but the front photograph here is from my mother's family home place, which is about 15 miles from here. Anybody heading south through Renfro Valley, stop off. My cousin has restored the house, and you can take a tour. I'll just read this little poem that in my mind is a kind of transition from the elegiac mode of the last poem I read, and this is just, in some ways, a celebration of the language. And if nothing else, we've learned yesterday, and probably we'll get more of it today, that there is something just naturally joyous in the language that we are lucky to listen to. This is called The Backwoods Ruckus. Today I woke the crows. How they squalled at me. How I called back, "You peckerwoods! You yahoo!" They followed. I'm welling up, remembering. Trees hooded, suddenly bald. Sad toodaloo.
Thank you, Maurice. I like that idea of finding the beauty in the language, and I too found that I was writing elegy after elegy after elegy, and I think as you get older, that's going to happen, because I'm losing more and more and more people at a high rate of speed and becoming the old folks myself, you know. But I think the nature of a lot of Appalachian writing is elegiac. I truly do. That's wonderful, and I like, you know, that nod to the language. Another thing that we talked about is displacement. You know, people living outside the region, wanting to go home. Why do we come back home? I don't know. So many of us, you know, have to come back home. So Lisa's living out of the region now. She's not living north or south. She's living in a swamp called Washington, D.C. And it literally is a swamp. If you know the history, you know, they dug that place out of a swamp. And she often turns her truck toward the mountains. But so she's riding from away, and she's lived in New York. She's lived other places and just keeps trying to get back south. So I thought we'd ask our displaced person here to read.
That's one way to get introduced. I think, and maybe this is particularly relevant at a university, is that I think many of us have had that experience of being displaced. I grew up sort of displaced with my feet in two very different worlds. My mama's family's from Buchanan County, Virginia, but they moved into Shenandoah Valley to keep the rest of the boys in the family out of coal mines. And my mama met my daddy, who is from Brooklyn, New York. Only the Army can bring these two worlds together. It's always fascinating. I was thinking, when we were talking about language, the eve before my sister's wedding, my grandparents, my Appalachian grandparents, and my Brooklyn, New York grandparents were sitting at a table trying to roll these little deli meats together and talk. And you've never seen such. My sister ran over and said, "Oh my God, you gotta go over there and sit with the old olds. They can't understand a word any of them are saying. They're just looking at each other trying to talk." And it was true. Between this very heavy Brooklyn accents and these very heavy Hill accents, they were just doing a lot of that, you know. So I think that the notion of kind of straddling these two things and what that means, I had never lived outside the South till I went to grad school. And I went to Penn State University for my MFA, and it was quite the awakening. And it was a real sense of loss. It was because on the one hand, I was getting this great experience that you get when you're out of your place, and I was enjoying that to some degree, and I was also having people say things like, "Holler's not a real word," and "Oh God, another black lung poem," just all kinds of things like that made me feel like, whew, I'm definitely out of my element. So I thought I would read one thing from that I saw Lee Smith at the Heinemann Settlement School my first summer after my first year at Penn State, and I said, "I'm just despairing. I don't want to go back. I don't even know what to write about." And she said, "Well, honey, just go back there and write the shit out of what you know." I thought, well, all right. So I ended up writing this poem, and it won the Randall Jarrell that year, and it turned my entire career around. And it was exactly the notion of what do you lose and what do you trade off, and what are the things you can speak about when you're displaced like that. So this poem is called "Snapping Beans." This is for my granny. I snapped beans into the silver bowl that sat on the splintering slats of the porch swing between my grandma and me. I was home for the weekend, from school, from the north. Grandma hummed "What a Friend We Have in Jesus" as the sun rose, pushing its pink spikes through the slant of corn stalks, through the fly-eyed mesh of the screen. We didn't speak until the sun overcame the feathered tips of the cornfield and Grandma stopped humming. I could feel the soft gray of her stare against the side of my face when she asked, "How's school going?" I wanted to tell her about my classes, the revelations by book and lecture, as real as any shout of faith, potent as a swig of strychnine. She reached the leather of her hand over the bowl and cupped my quivering chin. The slick smooth of her palm held my face the way she held cherry tomatoes under the spigot, careful not to drop them. And I wanted to tell her about the nights I cried into the familiar heartsick panels of the quilt she made me, wishing myself home on the evening star. I wanted to tell her the evening star was a planet, that my friends wore nose rings and wrote poetry about sex, about alcoholism, about Buddha. I wanted to tell her how my stomach burned acidic holes at the thought of speaking in class, speaking in an accent, speaking out of turn, how I was tearing, splitting myself apart with the slow, simmering guilt of being happy despite it all. I said, "School's fine." We snapped beans into the silver bowl between us, and when a hickory leaf, still summer green, skidded onto the porch front, Grandma said, "It's funny how things blow loose like that."
That poem must resonate with a lot of people, because if you students took AP English or in some English anthologies, that's in several of them. It's been anthologized over and over and over again in anthologies intended to be used for students.
My grandma's enjoyed that quite a bit. This came out, the anthologies came out before she passed. I was actually living in New York City. It was the strangest thing. And a friend of mine from the MFA program years before, called me in New York and said, "You have to hear this paper my student wrote about you." I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Well, I'm teaching from the Bedford St. Martin's anthology." I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. She said, "Your poem, Snapping Beans, is in this anthology." I said, "Are you kidding?" I had no idea. And so Bedford St. Martin's headquarters is in New York City, so I gave them a call. I'm like, "Hello." "What's up?" And they said, "Oh, God, we've been looking for you for years. We didn't think to look in New York City." And so, but it was interesting. So I said, "Well, could you send me a couple copies of that anthology? Because those things are expensive. I don't want to buy that." So they did. And when I went home and showed my grandma this thing, and at the end of it, it has the questions, that they do in the anthologies, and it says, "What is the grandmother's role in this? And what does the grandmother think of this?" And she just cackled, and she said, "Well, how about us? We get a cut in all this?" And she was really excited by that. But it was interesting, and I kind of, when I lived in New York, the sense of loss, I moved there 3 months before 9/11, so the timing of that was really quite tragic. But the sense of loss that I found myself writing about quite a bit for this book was that notion of when that rootedness comes out from under you, what do you turn to? And there's a poem in here that I won't read that, but it's about going when the city was still on fire and when we didn't know what was happening, and just running to Central Park and finding these big London plantain trees that looked just like sycamores from back home. And remembering my granddaddy always saying, no matter how lost you are, if you can find a sycamore, you can always find your way back, because you'll find the water and you'll find your way out. And I just ran to Central Park like a crazy person and found the nearest one of those trees and got over the little cage around it and just pressed myself up against it. And I thought, even in the worst moments of loss, you go to what you know. And to me, that was home and his voice and those things. But I'd like to just read one more. This is the last poem in my book, and this is called "This Gone Place." And it was just the notion of what happens when you're raised by Appalachians outside of Appalachia, always going down home and visiting this thing, and then coming back on occasion to find it so different and so gone that it was hard to recognize it. And this is called "I Mark This Gone Place with Foxfire," Buchanan County, Virginia. At the edge of coal country, I pull the car onto a switchback, stop where road and hollyhock run together. Where used to you could go this road to the top of Drill Mountain, I abandon the car to this unkept place, walk between overgrowth of briar and honeysuckle vine, walk until I find the crevice large enough to walk into where Granddaddy hid blackberry brandy. But I am too long in the city, too afraid of fast-moving critters who covet these dark niches. I reach in with only my leg, toes pointed, sweeping the floor for that bottle. I come away with nothing, gone as the road we used to drive together, gone as these mountains, peaks missing, lopped off by drag lines that decapitate it all, leave this strange foreign landscape, absent the rush of the dismal river, even the creeks dried up or gone underground. I find a poplar stump, sit against its damp wood, breathe deep and imagine apple blossoms, patches of pennyroyal, hillsides unvanished. This place gave you love and children, mandolin and shape note singing, a taste for squirrel gravy and fried bluegill, and those black lungs that finally slowed you to a stop. I stand and dig up the forest floor with the toes of my boots, break this rotting poplar up with my heels, push it in chunks beneath the ground, cover it over again. You taught me this trick. You said, I know this to be true. Sometimes when you bring up things rot and all, you get a queer thing of light, glowing even as it dies.
As I sit here and look across the panel, I think, boy, we cover the region. We have Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, and East Tennessee. So that's a pretty wide net for a panel.
It's also interesting that the kinds of loss and the various kinds of displacement are common across the region. It's not one little area hadn't been singled out for this kind of cultural deprivation.
Well, that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about in this last book, is because of environmental loss, the cultural loss that we're experiencing. And that's something Denise has written about extensively. She's pinch hitting for us today. But, you know, that is just a great theme, you know, in your work. It started out with strip mining, you know, when earlier on we were talking about strip mining, now it's mountaintop removal. And West Virginia's just been decimated. I drove up that way after not having been there for 5 or 6 years and was astounded because it was bad the last time I was there. Go ahead.
Well, I think about this subject often because I live in the region. I live in Charleston, West Virginia, but you don't have to leave the region to be displaced here.
That's right.
My entire life has been one of displacement in one way or the other, and I also think I've been asking myself when I found out I was going to be on this panel, is the Appalachian experience different from other people? Because it's part of the human condition to have loss. You know, we lose loved ones, we lose places, but is the Appalachian condition in some ways more I don't know if despairing is the right word or not, but I was thinking about a friend of mine who went to his high school reunion this summer. He's from Medford, Oregon, and he came back and he was like, I had such a great time. I saw my old buddies, and we visited our old haunts, and we went to the high school for the reunion, and the town looks the same. And I was like, I can't relate to that at all. I mean, nothing that I know in any place I have lived is there anymore the way it was. And I've even, to the point where I've said to myself especially the last 10, 15 years, I don't think I should love any place anymore, because if I love it, it's going to die. I mean, it's almost like the kiss of death. That's a terrible way to feel. But I grew up in McDowell County, West Virginia, and at a time when, in the 50s and 60s, when on the one hand it was thriving. There was there were a lot of people. There was a lot of activities. But I didn't know it as a child, but the death knell had sounded, and by the 60s people were starting to leave. And when I went back for a year in 1980 to live there, it had been decimated already. And the local Hardee's restaurant had bulletproof glass on the drive-through window because drugs were starting to be a problem. Now, everything is gone. I mean, buildings, institutions. A friend of mine is Chris Hedges, who was a war correspondent for the New York Times, who came back to work. He came to McDowell County for a book he's working on about places in America that have been destroyed, basically. He was a war correspondent in the 90s during the Balkan Wars, and he said to me after he got back from his visit to McDowell County, he said, it was like being in the Balkans again. That's what it looks like. And it is what it looks like. I have difficulty even going back. I went back for my uncle's funeral last summer, and I just basically tried not even to look around as I was driving in and driving out, because I tried to preserve in my mind the McDowell County that I knew when I was growing up, but it's gone. We moved because we were part of the displacement in the 60s when the coal industry started tanking and started mechanizing and so forth. We moved to the eastern part of Kanawha County, West Virginia, which is also a coal mining area, although also a chemical area and more diverse chemical plants and so forth. But now my high school is gone. In the 1990s, the federal government poured in a bunch of money to build new locks and dams on the Kanawha River in order to enlarge the locks so that the coal that is taken from the mountaintop removal sites all around the eastern part of the county, which has just been devastated by mountaintop removal. They wanted bigger barges, bigger locks, so they could send bigger barges through. So they totally destroyed two communities where my high school was. The happy memories you have of high school, the skating rink and all that, the recreational places and so forth, the drive-ins, all gone. It's just a flat wasteland where this lock is now. And a lot of people were displaced, and the high school closed. So those are the two home places that I had that are gone. I feel displaced now as a West Virginian. The West Virginia that I grew up in was a different place. It was fairly progressive, labor-oriented state that came in the 1960s within one vote in the legislature of banning strip mining. Not kidding. And today, we are a Republican-controlled state where according to a poll that was taken last week, our great hope for president is, by a landslide, is Donald Trump. And our favorite for governor is another billionaire, Jim Justice. So we are a people looking for a big sugar daddy to try to preserve us, which is not the West Virginia that I grew up in. The West Virginia I grew up in, I remember sitting next to a retired coal miner and struck up a conversation. And this was somebody who lived in Mingo County, West Virginia, wore overalls, and started giving me a lecture about, this is 1981, started giving me a lecture about Nelson Mandela in South Africa and how he was in prison and how terrible it was that the way the government was treating him, and how terrible apartheid was. And I was like, where did you learn this? And he said, oh, it was in the UMWA Journal. That was the West Virginia that I grew up in. That West Virginia I have been displaced from, or has been displaced. And I'm still trying to struggle with the new reality. So I don't know where I'm going with this, except to say that it makes me very, very sad. And it probably has been a motivating factor in all my fiction, because I see my fiction as trying to preserve the memory of what was. The next panel we're going to hear from some younger writers, and I hope they will say something hopeful to me in terms of saying, we see, this is where we see we can go, or this is, it's not, because I think people my age can fall into a nostalgia and go,
Yes.
oh God, it's just...
We can.
it's
We can.
And I don't want to do that, so I'll stop here.
Well, that kind of brings me to something that's in my book. Some years ago, I was involved at a small college in bringing a famous poet there to read. And this famous poet, I went to get at Tri-Cities Airport, and you knew they were hearing banjo music, the whole time. Got there, barely read, whiny, irrelevant stuff, and wouldn't stay over, barely signed books because they were so terrified of where they were, and just left a really bad taste in my mouth. And then not long after that, right up the road from where I live, 3-year-old Jeremy Davidson was killed in his crib by a boulder from an illegal strip mine on Black Mountain. And I was enraged by this. Well, it was near where my husband and I used to date when we first met. And then that fall, when school started, his 9-year-old brother, they had moved out of the coal fields and down to Kingsport, was in the classroom next door to me. And every morning, I saw that boy's face, and I got really hacked off, you know. So this poem comes, you know, out of that experience. Needless to say that the illegal strip mine paid a light fine, and that was it, though the family was compensated. How do you compensate for a 3-year-old? Really, you know? So I started with a quote from Seamus Heaney. It says, "The aim of the poet in poetry is finally to be of service, to apply the effort of the individual work into the larger work of the community as a whole." So this is called A Poet's Work, and it's for little Jeremy. Spare me the postmodern pout about the dog piss in the gray snow near the subway entrance, or the academic angst over a shaft of light like the one in a scriptorium of an obscure Tuscan monastery. Witness meth labs that spring up in our rural gardens, a quick payout for fuel, or 3 piddly jobs, 2 to live, 1 to pay daycare. Clutch the child who sobs silently, her mama a nurse in the guard, called up, good nights from a webcam in Basra. Behold mountaintops removed, laid low by greed, hollows filled, wells poisoned, God's majesty flattened, fit only for Walmart, the new ground zero. Support the woman who tosses in fitful sleep as a dozer strips her mountains under cover of dark, who wakes to thunder, boulders tumbled upon her baby in his bed. Revile the judgment of life's worth in coal country, a fine levied at $15,000, less than the price of a good pickup truck, how the law measures a baby's life. Spare me the postmodern pout, the academic angst, travel ruined roads, moonscape mountains, failed farms, and ponder judicial disregard, mindful of a poet's work, the naming of what matters. That wasn't really what I intended to read, but Denise just brought that out of me. I had to testify. I think I had that nostalgia for a place that wasn't there anymore, too. My first marriage was to someone from Southwest Virginia in coal country, and I go through there and think about all the old people who were displaced. You know, they're not there anymore. The country doesn't look the same. You can't even find your way by landmarks, you know? So
I think part of what was, Denise made a good point about how do you deal with this, and Maurice, you too, about as writers, you don't want to romanticize it, you don't want to wrap it in nostalgia, but you do want to witness it. You want to put it out there. And we were speaking with a novelist last night, a very successful novelist who is running into issues with a New York City editor who is, as she's writing about her truth, which is this experience of a chemical spill in this area, and is being told by these people that only happens in third world countries. Yeah. And she is, and this is a person of some clout, is having to have the argument that this is the truth I'm going to tell, and really struggling with that. And this is an up-and-coming writer, so it's how much truth can you put out if you're compelled to? What are we even stopped from saying? I think it's a part of that.
Well, in the third world country where I live,
Yeah.
I went without water for about 4 months last year. I couldn't take a bath for like 3 weeks because of our chemical spill. I don't know if that's the one she's writing about or not, but that's the reality of our West Virginia third world country. This is an old, I don't know. It runs through so much in Appalachia. My family actually lost, and maybe this is the way a writer responds. My family lost their home place in Pike County, Kentucky, because of the Fish Trap Dam that was built there. I don't know if those of you are from Pike County or know Fish Trap Dam. At one point they were talking about the dam covering the land where my family had their home place. Now, what happened was the lake actually is smaller. It was supposed to be for recreation, but I think it's so filled with silt from strip mines that it's not really. But the water never came up over our home place, but supposedly when it floods, then it would back up over the home place.
Well,
when I was a young person, some friends and I went to the home place to find it again, and we took sleeping bags and we spent the night on the home place. And I told my mom I was going to do that, and she was going to. She said, "There was a well there. Don't you fall down that well," because I don't know where it was. But we slept on the home place, and I felt like at least for that one night I was on my papa's land. And then I put it in a novel, and I think sleeping on that land helped me write Storming Heaven, and so the home place is still there, and I think that's the way a writer has to deal with loss.
right.
I would say too, we're kind of revealing a practice that is part of our region's history from very early on. Before coal mining, people thought they could come in and clear cut every damn tree there is, and they did it, and then expected people to figure out how to live there. And we did it. And going back to where the place was, the place that the human family had connection to, we're cursed in that place has been so often eradicated, but we're blessed in that we all have a place that we know, and that makes us, I think, different than other regions of this country, because we have this kind of dual experience of being rooted and facing the threat of being uprooted all the time.
And with that, I think we're out of time. Are we out of? I hear Silas. Okay, that's what.
You're right on time.
I've known him so long. I feel him back there. But rooted and displaced, and we thank you all for coming.
Thank you all very much. I'll just remind you that our next session goes to 10:30. I'll give you time to quietly exit as they come out. Directly following this session, which is Amy Green, Charles Dodd White, Glenn Taylor, and Robert Gopp, so you may not want to miss that. As soon as they're finished, there'll be a book signing right over here in this room. Be sure to come for that. All the panelists that just left will be on it, and these panelists will be on it. After the book signing, we'll have the We're Here, Diversity in Appalachian Lit will start, and I'll tell you more later.